The morning came in shades of gray, draped across the Italian hills like wet canvas. Corporal James Dalton lay in a ditch that had stopped being a ditch weeks ago and had become something closer to a grave. One he simply hadn't died in yet. The mud pressed against his ribs, his hips, the side of his face. It smelled of clay and iron and the particular sourness that came from earth churned by shells and soaked by winter rain. March in Cassino meant cold that worked its way through every layer, through wool and canvas and skin, settling somewhere behind the sternum where no amount of coffee or cigarette smoke could reach it. It was 6:47 in the morning on March 12, 1944, and Dalton was watching a German scout car approach from the north. The vehicle moved with the cautious aggression of something that knew it owned the road. 15 miles per hour, maybe less. Its engine made a sound like grinding metal teeth, distant but growing louder. Through the thin morning mist Dalton could see the angular silhouette, the jutting aerials, the way the machine ate up the rutted dirt road with methodical confidence. Somewhere inside that steel shell were men, German soldiers doing exactly what Dalton was doing, trying to stay alive long enough to see another dawn. He tried not to think about that too much. His fingers were wrapped around something that wasn't regulation. A shovel handle, 18 inches long, wrapped tight with rusted barbed wire he'd pulled from a blown-out farmhouse 3 days earlier. The wire was old, pitted with corrosion, the kind that left rust flakes on your palms and tetanus in your bloodstream if you weren't careful. He'd wrapped it methodically, layer over layer, until the handle felt heavy with purpose. It wasn't much. It wasn't anything, really, but it was what he had. The 34th Infantry Division had arrived in Italy with grand notions of mechanized warfare and coordinated assaults. What they'd found instead was mud, mountains, and a German defensive line that turned every farmhouse into a fortress and every road into a killing ground. They had rifles, plenty of those. They had mortars that worked when the rain let up. What they didn't have were anti-tank rifles. No bazookas in sufficient numbers. No mines to speak of. The supply chain back to Naples was a joke. A tangle of bureaucratic delays and priority shuffles that meant frontline companies went weeks without basic equipment while rear echelon units sat on stockpiles they'd never use. Meanwhile, German reconnaissance cars prowled the roads with impunity. Light armor, fast-moving, armed with machine guns and radio sets that called in artillery strikes before you could blink. They'd already lost 11 men in the past month to those damned cars. 11 men who'd been walking a road, setting up a position, rotating back from the line. The cars would appear, spray lead, and vanish before anyone could respond. The division's after-action reports documented each incident with clinical precision. Noted the problem. Recommended solutions. Nothing changed. Military Doctrine approved 16 official methods of disabling light armor. Dalton had memorized them all during basic training at Camp Roberts. Back when California sun had seemed like something that would last forever, before Italy taught him that warmth was a lie the world told you before taking it away. Magnetic mines, shaped charges, satchel explosives, anti-tank grenades if you could get close enough, which you couldn't. Every method required equipment they didn't have or circumstances that never materialized. Doctrine was beautiful on paper. Doctrine assumed supply lines that worked and officers who understood that regulations couldn't stop shrapnel. Dalton's method wasn't among the 16. His method involved 60 feet of barbed wire, 2 entrenching shovels, and the kind of desperate ingenuity that came from watching men die for no good reason. He'd been warned twice already. Once by Lieutenant Kohler, who'd found him reinforcing a foxhole with scavenged lumber instead of sandbags. Once by Captain Morrison himself, who delivered a 10-minute lecture about unauthorized field modifications and the importance of maintaining unit cohesion through standardized procedures. Morrison was a decent man, probably. West Point, 3 years older than Dalton but somehow seeming younger, still believing that war followed rules if you just enforced them hard enough. Dalton had nodded through the lecture, said yes, sir, in the right places, and gone back to his section of the line knowing nothing would change unless someone made it change. The scout car was closer now. 400 yards. Maybe 350. Dalton could hear the transmission whining as it navigated a shell crater, the chassis creaking. His heartbeat had slowed to something steady and cold. Fear was still there. Fear never left, not after your first month in combat. but it had become manageable. A weight you learned to carry the way you carried your pack and your rifle and the knowledge that any moment might be your last. The night before, he'd gone out alone. 2,300 hours, moonless, the kind of darkness that pressed against your eyes like a physical thing. He'd told Private First Class Eddie Kern he was checking the wire, which wasn't a lie exactly, just not the whole truth. Kern had nodded, too tired to ask questions, and Dalton had slipped over the lip of their position with his makeshift tool and 2 shovels and 60 feet of wire coiled over his shoulder. The road was a quarter-mile north, running east-west through a shallow valley the Germans used for their reconnaissance runs. Dalton had watched them for 3 days, timing their patterns. They came through twice daily, usually early morning and late afternoon, scout cars probing for weak points, gathering intelligence, testing American responses. The road surface was hard-packed dirt, rutted by traffic, with drainage ditches on either side overgrown with dead winter grass. He'd planted the shovels on opposite sides of the road, blade down, handles angled inward. The dirt there was softer than he'd expected. Recent rain had loosened it, and the shovels went in clean after 3 sharp blows with the flat of his hand. Then the wire. He'd strung it tight between the handles, stretched at exactly 14 inches above the road surface. Axle height. He'd measured it twice by counting hand widths, the way his father had taught him to measure fence posts back in Nebraska before the drought had driven them off the land. The wire sang slightly in the night wind, a thin metallic hum that set his teeth on edge. He'd covered it lightly with mud, just enough to kill the shine without weighing it down, then crawled backward along the ditch for 100 yards before standing and walking back to the line. No one had seen him. No one knew. He'd lain awake until dawn, watching the sky lighten by invisible degrees, wondering if he'd just made the stupidest mistake of his life or done the only smart thing anyone had done in this whole godforsaken sector. Now the scout car was 300 yards out. 250. Dalton could see the driver now, a shadow behind the slanted viewport, probably some 19-year-old from Bavaria or Saxony who wanted to be anywhere but here. The machine gun mounted on the turret tracked slowly back and forth. Standard sweep pattern. They weren't expecting trouble. Not here. Not from Americans who didn't have the equipment to cause trouble. 200 yards. Dalton's mouth was dry. He'd positioned himself in the ditch 100 yards south of the wire, close enough to see what happened, far enough to avoid being in the immediate kill zone if something went wrong. His rifle lay beside him, safety off, though he knew he wouldn't use it unless absolutely necessary. Shooting would bring attention, questions, officers with suspicious eyes and clipboards. 150. The car's engine note changed as it picked up speed slightly. The driver had seen clear road ahead, was accelerating into what looked like safe ground. Dalton thought about calling out, stopping this, claiming later he'd spotted enemy movement and wanted to verify before engaging. But that was cowardice talking, fear wrapped in excuses. This had to happen. This was necessary. 100 yards. 75. 50. The wire caught the axle with a sound Dalton would remember for the rest of his life. A sharp metallic snap followed immediately by a shriek of tearing metal and rubber. The scout car's front end dropped like someone had cut its strings. The rear lifted, tires still spinning, and for a fraction of a second the whole vehicle seemed suspended in midair, tilted at an impossible angle. Then physics took over. The car flipped, rolled once, smashed down on its side with a sound like a building collapsing. Glass shattered. The turret tore loose. Something inside exploded. Not ammunition, probably the fuel line rupturing, and black smoke boiled up into the gray morning. Dalton was moving before he'd made the conscious decision to move. He scrambled out of the ditch, sprinted low across the 100 yards of open ground. The smoke was thick now, oily, catching in his throat. He could hear someone screaming inside the wreck, high and desperate, the sound cutting through the engine's dying whine. His hands found the wire, slick with oil and still warm from friction. He unwrapped it from the shovel handles, coiled it quickly, pulled the shovels free and threw them into the ditch. 60 seconds. Maybe 90. Then he was crawling back toward his position, the wire bundled in his arms, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. He'd just reached the drainage ditch when he heard boots pounding down the road from the American lines. Voices shouting in English. Lieutenant Kohler's voice, sharp with adrenaline, calling for a medic even though everyone could hear by now that the screaming had stopped. Dalton slid into the ditch, buried the wire under a pile of rubble and mud, and forced himself to breathe slowly. His hands were shaking. He wiped them on his trousers, smearing rust and oil into the fabric, then picked up his rifle and sighted down the road as if he'd been in position the whole time. Captain Morrison arrived 10 minutes later, picking his way carefully around the burning wreck. The German crew hadn't survived. The flip had broken necks, crushed chest cavities, done the brutal mathematics of metal versus flesh. Morrison stood looking at the scene with the expression of a man trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. He walked the road, studying the ruts, the tire marks, the shallow depression where the shovels had been planted. "Corporal Dalton," he called finally. "You see what happened here?" Dalton stood, came to attention. "No, sir." Heard the crash, came running. "Looked like they hit something in the road, sir. Maybe drove into a crater too fast." Morrison's eyes were hard. "There's no crater. Road's clear." "Yes, sir." "Can't explain it, sir." They stood looking at each other. Morrison knew something was wrong. Dalton could see it in the way the captain's jaw worked, the way his eyes kept flicking between Dalton and the wreck and the road. But knowing something and proving it were different animals. "Get back to your position, Corporal." "Yes, sir." Dalton walked back slowly, feeling Morrison's stare on his back the whole way. Private Kern was waiting in their foxhole, his face pale in the morning light.
Jesus Christ, Dalton.
"Was that you? Keep your voice down." "Holy hell. How'd you?" "Doesn't matter. And you didn't see anything. Clear?" Kern nodded slowly. "Clear. But of course it didn't stay clear. That's not how armies work. Rumors move faster than orders, and by nightfall half the company knew that someone had figured out how to stop the German scout cars with nothing but shovels and wire. No one knew exactly who. No one said Dalton's name out loud. But men started looking at him differently, quick glances, small nods, the kind of recognition that stayed beneath the official surface. Over the next 3 days, Dalton watched as other men started improvising. Sergeant Gutierrez from 3rd Platoon set up a wire trap on the eastern approach road. Failed the first try, placed it too high, the car passed underneath, but succeeded on the second attempt 2 days later. March 18th, another scout car flipped on a southern access road. Wire stretched between fence posts this time instead of shovels. March 21st, 2 more cars disabled within an hour of each other. The Germans noticed. Of course they noticed. Their reconnaissance runs became more cautious, slower, drivers scanning the roads with paranoid intensity. Some routes they abandoned entirely, rerouting around sectors where their vehicles kept meeting mysterious catastrophic failures. American intelligence noted the change but couldn't explain it. The official reports mentioned possible mechanical failures, maybe sabotage by Italian partisans. Nothing conclusive. By April 10th, someone in Company HQ had started documenting the phenomenon.
17 wire installations.
87% success rate. 0 American casualties. Cost per installation. 60 feet of barbed wire and 2 entrenching shovels. Total value approximately $4.30. A report went up the chain. Dalton never saw it, but Kern heard about it from a clerk who'd typed it up. The report recommended immediate adoption of the technique as standard anti-reconnaissance doctrine. The recommendation was denied. The method remained unauthorized. Military doctrine, apparently, changed slower than glaciers and with considerably less grace. But frontline soldiers didn't care about authorization. They cared about staying alive. By July, the technique had spread to other regiments. By August, it was being used in southern France after the invasion. Men teaching men, squad by squad, foxhole by foxhole, the knowledge passing through whispered conversations and practical demonstrations that never appeared in any training manual. Dalton never took credit, never sought it. There was something almost peaceful about the anonymity, about knowing he'd done something that mattered while his name stayed buried in the mud and smoke of Cassino. Captain Morrison never confronted him directly, though the suspicion never quite left the captain's eyes. Twice more he called Dalton in for unofficial conversations, fishing for admission, finding nothing. Morrison was transferred out in June. His replacement, Captain Davies, never learned there was anything to suspect. The fighting dragged on. Cassino fell finally in May, after 4 months of brutal attrition that turned the town into rubble and the surrounding hills into a moonscape. The 34th pushed north through the summer, through Florence, into the Gothic line where German resistance stiffened again and the whole terrible cycle started over. New men arrived to replace the dead and wounded. Old men went home on rotation or in body bags. Dalton stayed squad leader now, then sergeant, teaching new troops how to stay low, how to read terrain, how to improvise when Doctrine failed. He never told them about the wire. Somehow that seemed wrong, like claiming ownership of something that belonged to all of them. Everyone who'd ever been desperate enough to break regulations because regulations were killing people. The method had become common knowledge by then anyway, part of the informal education every soldier received from the men who'd been in country longest. Someone would show the new guys how to string the wire, where to place the anchors, what height worked best. They'd practice it during lulls in the fighting, setting up dummy installations and checking angles. Officers looked the other way. Even the ones who cared about proper procedure understood by then that survival trumped doctrine, always had, always would. The war in Italy ended in April 1945. Dalton was in a farmhouse outside Bologna when the news came through, sitting at a wooden table with 3 other sergeants, playing cards with a greasy deck someone had carried from North Africa. The announcement came over the radio, crackling through static. German forces in Italy have surrendered unconditionally. Effective 1,400 hours, May 2, 1945. The 4 of them sat in silence for maybe 30 seconds. Then Gutierrez said, "Well, shit," and someone else laughed, and that was it. The world kept turning. Dalton went home in July. Troop ship to New York, then train west through landscape that seemed impossibly clean, impossibly peaceful, fields without craters and towns where the buildings still had roofs. Nebraska looked smaller than he remembered. His mother cried when she saw him, clutched him so hard he could feel her ribs through her dress. His father shook his hand, said, "Welcome home, son," and they never spoke about the war again. He worked construction for a while. Got married in 1947 to a schoolteacher named Margaret, who asked him once about Italy and accepted his silence as answer. They had 2 daughters. Built a life that was ordinary and precious in its ordinariness. Dalton would lie awake some nights, listening to Margaret breathe beside him, and think about mud and wire and the sound of metal tearing. Mostly he tried not to think about it at all. In 1949, a letter arrived from the Department of the Army. Official letterhead, typewritten, addressed to Sergeant James Dalton, United States Army, retired. He opened it at the kitchen table while Margaret made coffee, reading the formal language with growing bewilderment. The letter informed him that new field manual FM 5-15, engineering field data, now included specifications for wire obstacle deployment against light reconnaissance vehicles. The technique involved stretching high-tensile wire at axle height between anchored supports. Recommended materials: barbed wire, entrenching tools, wooden stakes. Estimated success rate, 85 to 90%. Recommended for all infantry divisions. There was no mention of Cassino. No mention of March 1944. No mention of Corporal James Dalton or anyone else who'd strung wire across dark roads while officers slept and regulations gathered dust. The technique had been analyzed, tested, refined, and absorbed into official doctrine as if it had always existed, a natural evolution of tactical thinking rather than the desperate improvisation of men who refused to keep dying the same way. Margaret asked what the letter said. Dalton folded it carefully, tucked it into his shirt pocket. Nothing important. Old army business. She looked at him with those sharp schoolteacher eyes that saw through everything. But she didn't push. That was one of the things he loved about her. She knew which silences to respect. He kept the letter in a drawer for 20 years. Took it out occasionally when he couldn't sleep. Sometimes he wondered if Morrison had ever known, if the captain had connected the burning scout cars to the corporal who'd been warned twice about unauthorized modifications. Probably not. Morrison had survived the war, Dalton had heard, made major, served in Korea. Good for him. The war had eaten so many. Anyone who'd made it out deserved whatever piece they could find. The wire trick saved lives. Dalton knew that with cold certainty. How many exactly was impossible to calculate. Dozens, maybe more. Men who'd come home to wives and children, who'd worked jobs and paid taxes and lived ordinary lives because a German scout car had hit a wire stretched at 14 inches and flipped instead of completing its patrol run and calling in artillery on American positions. The math was invisible but real, and his name wasn't on it, would never be on it. The technique had entered military history as common knowledge, author unknown, one of 1,000 small innovations born from necessity and refined through practice. Like the hedge cutters welded to tank hulls in Normandy. Like the trick of wrapping tank tracks in spare treads for extra traction in snow. Soldier wisdom passed hand to hand, too practical to wait for official approval. Dalton thought about that sometimes, about anonymity and legacy. In the end, he decided he preferred it this way. The wire had never been about recognition. It had been about Kern and Gutierrez and all the other men in the line who deserved to see another morning. They'd lived. Most of them, anyway. That was enough. He died in 1983, quietly, in his sleep, with Margaret holding his hand. The obituary in the local paper mentioned his service in Italy, his Purple Heart, his 40 years working construction and raising a family. It said he was a good man, a good father, a good husband. It didn't mention wire obstacles or scout cars or March 12, 1944. But somewhere in a filing cabinet at Fort Benning, Field Manual FM 5-15 still carried the specifications. Axle height, 60 feet minimum. High tensile wire. Anchored supports. The words were different, cleaned up, made official. The idea was the same. A desperate solution born in mud and validated by blood. Now codified, standardized, taught to new generations who would never know where it came from. In the end, maybe that's what mattered. Not the name on the innovation, but the fact that it worked. That it saved lives. That some corporal in some future war would string wire across some road and live to see tomorrow because another corporal 40 years earlier had been willing to break regulations when regulations failed. The wire remained, stretched across history, invisible but enduring, connecting the desperate present to the ordinary future. Dalton's legacy, unclaimed and undeniable, measured not in medals or recognition but in the quiet arithmetic of men who came home.